During the December council meetings of Springwater Township, council members voted to provide tax relief to residents instead of allocating funds to reserves. The township received a one-time financial aid of more than $400,000 from the province concerning municipal police services. Ward 5 Councillor Phil Fischer proposed an amendment to use $147,000 of this relief to reduce the tax levy.
I fear the mentality that we'll deal with problems in the future by taxing people today. I mean, it's a bit of a socialist approach, frankly. I think that this is the taxpayer's money. Everyone up here is a taxpayer. Everyone out here is a taxpayer. This belongs to the taxpayer.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Just on the topic of budget, obviously, while we're speaking to it, of course, we've significantly pushed many projects off, and I'm not going to rehash the past. I've already shared my concerns in regards to that, and I don't disagree with portions of what Councillor Fischer is indicating in regards to ensuring folks can save money today. But we also know that next year is going to most likely be more challenging than this year's conversation was, especially because of the reductions that were put in place by our council to ensure we provided a reasonable increase to our residents. So I do have concerns about next year.
Despite Mayor Jennifer Coughlin's recommendation to place the funds in reserves to offset future increases in policing costs, the council voted to provide tax relief to residents. In another matter, the City of Barrie's annexation discussions with Oro-Medonte and Springwater raised concerns in Springwater as well. Hempson Consulting presented a land needs analysis for Springwater, Oro-Medonte and Barrie. According to the presentation, while Barrie has sufficient employment land for the long term, it faces a shortage of shovel-ready land. The proposed annexation lands in Oro-Medonte and Springwater were deemed unsuitable for employment purposes due to environmental and other constraints. A work plan will be developed with the inputs from all parties and brought back to Springwater Council. The council also discussed a ward boundary review due to significant population growth since 2013 and 14. Jack Amolia of Watson and Associate presented findings that highlighted substantial population growth since the last review. The current ward system shows a major disparity in population between the largest and smallest wards. Two final options were presented to the council. Option 1 would provide a more balanced approach, although it would result in some larger, less connected wards. On the other hand, option 2 recommends a tweak in the current system that resolves major issues but still require further adjustments. Following is our coverage of the meetings.
Move on to our budget. May I have a mover and seconder for this, please? Councillor Fischer and Councillor Moore. That the report from the Director of Finance regarding the adoption of the 2025-26 budget and business plan dated December 18th, 2024 be received, and that the proposed 2025 tax-based operating budget, proposed 2025 water operating budget, proposed 2025 wastewater operating budget, and proposed 2025 capital budget be approved. Are there any comments or questions on this? Councillor Fischer?
I wonder if I could ask a question through you to Director Bedard. With the money coming back from the OPP, could you speak to the amount left over for us, please?
Director Bedard?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Fischer. The remaining reduction from the OPP financial relief that's being provided is $147,330. So 147,330.
Councillor Fischer?
Sorry. Is it possible to propose an amendment where we take that money and put it towards the tax levy?
Yes. Let's look for a seconder for that. Councillor Moore? And that would be do you have a motion or just that is the motion? Were you able to capture Clerk Marshall?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Based on the amendment that I've heard, I have that the full amount of financial relief from the province regarding municipal police services in the amount of $432,330 be included in the 2025 budget.
And Deputy Cabral and Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Actually, through you to Director Bedard, could you revise the number then for the tax levy based on that additional $147,000, where we would then be sitting? Thank you.
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Deputy Cabral. If the motion as amended was passed, the tax rate township portion would be 5.78% increase. Blended increase would be 4.06%.
Councillor Thompson?
Through the chair to Director Bedard, so would there be other options for this money? What plans did you have for this money if this motion hadn't come forward?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Thompson. Without the amendment, the difference would flow through to the surplus at year end. So it would impact the 2025 year end surplus or deficit. Given the discussion throughout budget deliberations regarding the amount of debt that we're taking on, it would be my recommendation that this surplus would be applied against any debt. That seemed to be agreeable through budget deliberations, therefore reducing the amount of debt we have to take on and reducing the debt requirements and the annual repayment of such. There are other options. We know it costs $3 million to police the township in 2025. It just so happens that the province is chipping in or reducing that amount by $433,000 approximately. Without a change to the OPP billing model, we have to assume that it will cost $3 million or $3 million plus next year to police the township. If we were to reduce the OPP levy based on the full financial relief, we may be looking at a tax increase in the future. We just have that uncertainty where we know it costs $3 million to police the township. It just so happens that this year the province is providing that relief to make it more affordable to municipalities. Without a change to the billing model and without that continued financial relief, we would be looking at that $433,000 plus increase in 2026.
Councillor Fischer?
Thank you, Director Bedard. Of course, we don't really know what the OPP fees will be in the future, but my rationale is that we do know that people need to save money right now, and I think given the present economic climate, I think it would be smart just to give it back to the taxpayer. Ultimately, this is taxpayers' money, and I think that we're not in the business of spending their money or shelving it for further expenses. I think it's well suited. It's found money at this point, and we should be giving it back to the taxpayer.
Councillor Garwood?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Just on the topic of budget, obviously, while we're speaking to it, of course, we've significantly pushed many projects off, and I'm not going to rehash the past. I've already shared my concerns in regards to that, and I don't disagree with portions of what Councillor Fischer is indicating in regards to ensuring folks can save money today. But we also know that next year is going to most likely be more challenging than this year's conversation was, especially because of the reductions that were put in place by our council to ensure we provided a reasonable increase to our residents. So I do have concerns about next year. So then through the mayor to Director Bedard, understanding we don't know what that OPP total will be, and the province has not indicated anything beyond the 2025 budget year. In theory, the $147,330 in addition to what was already included in the 25 budget could be applied or could be held and applied to whatever that increase would be in 2026, correct?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Garwood, with Council's direction, that is something we could consider, placing that $147,000 in a policing reserve and then holding that to offset any potential increase with the 2026 OPP costs.
Councillor Fischer?
I see where Councillor Garwood is coming from. Unfortunately, I see it as we may be paying more tax. We may in the future, but what you're essentially saying is just keep the tax now. So I'd much rather not tax citizens now. We'll deal with that in the future. But if it's 6 or 1/2 dozen the other, I would much rather give it back to the taxpayer in the present year. If we do see an increase in the OPP fees, rather than taxing people now and keeping this money, I would much rather give it back to the citizens, and we'll see what the future turns out to be in terms of expenditures. But people need this money now, and I don't think it's ours to keep. It belongs to the taxpayer.
Councillor Alexander?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Director Bedard. If we had done our budget in January, say, as some municipalities do, so this directive would have come through prior to like our deliberations, would this just have automatically reduced the rate because the OPP is almost its own, well, it is its own line item. I know it is all lumped in to the actual tax rate, but it is its own line item. So would this just conversation not even almost be up for discussion had we'd not started budget deliberations and this relief didn't come partway through?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Alexander, if we started budget deliberations in January, this would just be a line item showing the 2025 policing cost to be approximately 2.5 million. That said, the conversation we had throughout budget deliberations, I imagine, would be different given we wouldn't have the financial pressures that we faced earlier, and I imagine decisions were made might be different.
Councillor Garwood?
Thank you, Mayor Colgan. Just more of a statement, and it'll be my last one on this matter specifically. I do have worry with sitting here saying we'll deal with something in the future. Unfortunately, I think that's what has been occurred in recent years and many past years, and not only our community, but others. And we don't know what next year's going to bring. But what we do know is most likely expenses are going to continue to rise. We have sat here for 3 budget cycles now, and each cycle, the same issues come up. Costs are rising, expenses are rising, and therefore those costs are being put onto our residents. We don't know a lot of what's going to happen next year, but it's almost certain that nothing's going to get cheaper. So anyway, I would hope that we could be forward thinking and planning for the future and put ourselves in a better position so we aren't just dealing with it in the future, because it's going to come around sooner than later. And again, I worry we'll be in the same, or if not a worse position in another 12 months.
CEO Schmidt?
Thank you, Mayor Colgan. Just to maybe echo Councillor Garwood's comments, and maybe to go a little bit further, what we do know is policing is $3 million. And we also know that this is a one-time relief of $432,000. And council can make their decision as to how they wish to apply that one-time relief. But we do know policing is $3 million, and it's likely not to get any less. So again, the decision is yours. I would suggest that the comments, as Councillor Garwood mentioned, it's not going to get any cheaper. And so putting some money aside for future relief is something that council should be looking at. Again, we've had this conversation through this budget cycle. The burden is not getting any less next year. So I put that in front of council for your consideration.
Thank you, CEO Schmidt, and thank you, Director Bedard. I do appreciate your knowledge on this, and I think that understanding that it is a one-time, that we are not, there's been no communication suggesting that there's going to be any change to this. If we can take it, and right now we've separated it, apply some this year, apply the rest next year to provide that relief, because if we apply it all this year, we're just going to have a 3% increase next year that we'll be battling over. So I saw Councillor Fischer and then Deputy Cabral.
I fear the mentality that we'll deal with problems in the future by taxing people today. I mean, it's a bit of a socialist approach, frankly. I think that this is the taxpayer's money. Everyone up here is a taxpayer. Everyone out here is a taxpayer. This belongs to the taxpayer. Yes, it is relief, but we should be giving this relief back to the tax-paying citizens. We're not their bankers, right? So this is the right thing to do. If we do see an increase in the future, which we already have, we will deal with it through taxation. But what I'm viewing is keep the tax money now so that we can deal with it in the future. versus tax in the future. To me, it's 6 or 1/2 dozen the other. The main difference is the taxpayer gets to enjoy a lower tax rate for the next year, and I think that's money in the pocket of the constituents, and I think it's the right thing to do. I'm not trying to play banker for the community. So,
Deputy Cabral,
I'm going to pass, Mayor Coughlin. Thank you.
any further questions or comments on this? Before I call the vote, I think that when statements are made that not saving for tomorrow is financial planning as well. So I think that by ensuring that we do have a reserve, that we have healthy reserves, that we continue to put money away, it's not that we want to taxing someone today and taxing someone tomorrow. It's the same tax. It's the same rate player. So for me, I won't be supporting the amendment. I think that the plan and how our CFO and our CAO have brought this forward, I think is in good planning. So I will not be supporting this amendment. Deputy Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I'm just going to point out that the estimate of $285,000 was originally included in the reduction. So when we looked like we were getting some back, we as a council decided to provide some relief with that reduction. And then as time progressed, we find out there's a little bit larger of a reduction. And now we're saying that maybe we should hold that and move it forward. I'm going to have to agree with Councillor Fischer. If the number had have been that at the very beginning, that would have been the number that we would have been using. And I think we would have probably done what we did, which was utilize the relief from the OPP costing to reduce the taxation on our residents. So that's where I sit. Thank you.
Councillor Fischer.
Just one last comment. Taxing them now or taxing them in the future is not the same. There's time value of money, and that value in money in our constituents' pockets, they can do what they want with it. They can invest it. It's not our job to keep it and hold it for them. Really, at 0% as it devalues. So, if we're talking about financial planning, we can't only think about ourselves. This is their money, and we should be giving that back to the taxpayer. We're here to run services, not only build up reserves. So I disagree. I'd like it to go back to the taxpayer, and I think the taxpayer in this present economic climate, I'll even say with the news coming out of Ottawa, not to make it federal, the debt that we're in, I really think that this should go back to the taxpayer. So be the last comment on it from me.
Council, we're voting on the amendment. All those in favor? That has carried. So we have the main motion as amended. Are there any further discussion on the main motion as amended? Not seeing any. All those in favor? And that has carried. We will now move on for our action reports, and mover and seconder, please. Councillors Moore and Thompson. That action report 7.2 and 7.3 be received, and that the recommendations contained therein be approved as presented. 7.2 is our MOU with the South Central Regional Snowmobile Clubs, and 7.3 is the Canadian Housing Infrastructure Fund. Any comments or questions on these? Not seeing any. All those in favor? And that has carried. And mover and seconder for information reports, please. I have Councillors Thompson and Moore. That the report items listed herein be received as information. Our Building Services Monthly Report, Bylaw Activity Report for November 2024, Winter Operations Plan for 24-25, Corporate Credit Card Report for September 24, Corporate Credit Card Report for October of 24, Vendor Check Register for October of 24, and Vendor Check Register for November of 24. Any comments or questions on any of these? All those in favor? And that has carried. We'll now move on to our verbal reports, and I will turn to Deputy Cabral for a county update. No county update. And municipal reports, municipal updates. And before I do move to members of council, I would like to take a moment here. I'd like to acknowledge and take time to recognize our library board chair, Adrian Graham, who is the recipient of the 2025 Ontario Public Library Association's James Bryan Medallion. The James Bain Medallion is awarded to a library board member who has demonstrated outstanding leadership in governing public libraries in Ontario. This annual province-wide award recognizes and honors the best contributions and efforts of board members who govern public libraries. Adrian will be presented with this award at the Ontario Public Library Association in January in Toronto. On behalf of Council, Adrian, I would like to offer a heartfelt thank you for everything that you and your board members are committed to and dedicated to for us. Thank you for your leadership, skills and knowledge which support the library system for our residents. Congratulations on your award. And I will turn to members. Yes, there we go. Councillor Alexander and then Councillor Garwood.
Sorry. I just wanted to speak to the Hillsdale tree lighting a week and a half ago, I guess now. Great event, tons of turnout. As always, a great group of volunteers who put this on. So thank you to them, to the firefighters who went in there to raise their money, selling the Christmas trees. It was just all around a really fun event, a little chilly, but I guess that's what the Christmas events are about, is the snow. So.
Councillor Garwood.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Yes, it's been the December of holiday events in Springwater. There's lots of them. I wanted to congratulate the Elmvale Sleigh Ride in the Village, which occurred on December the 6th. Also, over the past week or so, I've had the opportunity to attend the Anton Mills various events, whether that be their Christmas tree lighting, their Santa Claus parade, as well as the Minising tractor parade and tree lighting. I'll let Councillor Thompson speak about those, but congratulations to those CRAs. I also wanted to speak about an event that's actually happening in Elmvale this Saturday. It's called Kilometers for Kindness. So lace up your sneakers and get ready to walk, run, or jog to make a difference in the community. Funds raised assist women and children experiencing homelessness and domestic violence. So the event will take place at Heritage Park in Elmvale. It is a 5-kilometer run or walk or jog, and registration opens at 10:30. So I'll be attending. I know the mayor will also be there. The event is run by a youth of the Elmvale community, and so I wanted to commend her for her efforts. I believe so far the event's raised nearing $4,000, which is absolutely incredible. So I wanted to congratulate her and the Kilometers for Kindness group. In addition, on December the 6th, I had the opportunity to attend the King Charles III Coronation Medal ceremony. The ceremony is designed to, and the medal is designed to recognize the outstanding contributions of members of our community. That evening, Dan Clement, a lifelong resident of Elmvale who has devoted decades to serving his community, was honored with the award, hosted by MP Doug Shipley and MPP Doug Downey. Dan's impressive community service includes his tenure as past president of the Elmvale Maple Syrup Festival and Elmvale Fall Fair, and Springwater Township's Ward 1 councillor for 2 terms. I commend Dan for his continued commitment to the Elmvale community, and to all Springwater residents who were honored that evening, including Mayor Coughlin, who also was nominated and received the King Charles III Coronation Medal for her decade of public service to the Springwater community. So I wanted to congratulate. I'm sure I might get in trouble later for mentioning it, but anyway, I wanted to congratulate Dan, Mayor Coughlin, and all Springwater residents who were nominated and received this award. It was a pretty special honor to attend.
Thank you, Councillor Garwood. Councillor Thompson.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mayor Coughlin, for recognizing Adrian Graham and the library board. I have the privilege of working with these fine people on a regular basis. They do an outstanding job, and they're a real credit to our community. I'd also like to recognize the Elmvale and District Food Bank. I'd like to start by just reading a little thank you that they have on their website. They state, "Thank you to everyone in our community. We are so thankful to everyone who has taken time to donate, time to organize food drives, time to donate financially, and time to volunteer. Everyone has helped us to help others this past year. Together, we are making a difference in our community. Thank you." I had the privilege of being with other council members in the food bank this week, and we We had a wonderful opportunity and wonderful visit there. While there, Manager McLean mentioned more than once how generous of a community that we live in. It's commendable that our food bank is managed and run all by competent volunteers. A great achievement for sure. In fact, there is so much interest in helping, they have a waiting list for people wanting to join. I agree, we live in a very giving community. I extend my thanks to the Minising and Anton Mills Recreation Associations for their festive events. I would call it the Christmas Marathon. we do a lot of things over Christmas, and their recent successful food drives. I add my thank you to all of our volunteers, and a special thanks to the Springwater volunteer firefighters who seem to be everywhere. The volunteers of Springwater keep demonstrating to me that Christmas is far more than what you can buy in a store. Keep up the good work. From my family to yours, have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. And before I do go to Councillor Fischer, I would also like to acknowledge and a very special thank you to Norm Godfrey. We were able to not only match, but double the donation of the township. This is on behalf of Tribute Communities in Stone Manor Woods. So thank you very much, Mr. Godfrey, for the support of our food bank. Councillor Fischer?
All right, just wanted to let everyone know that winter icing at the Midhurst Pavilion in Dorn Park has started. It started this last week, and we had some real luck. I think we got up to nearly an inch of ice, which is amazing. We gave most of it back over the last 48 hours, so unfortunately, but there is still some there, and I believe the temperature dips this evening, so it'll start again this evening, if not early in the morning. The goal of the volunteers is to before Christmas, so that residents can be skating on it. So the facility's in good shape and ready to go. I just wanted to say too to the rest of the councillors and watching, a few times last year, the volunteers and I, were there at 9 o'clock at night, and it's always nice to run into people using it who aren't necessarily from Midhurst, from other communities. Ran into so a lot of young lads from Phelpston, and we encourage them because they're actually really fun, nice gentlemen out there, and so I really encourage people from different communities in Springwater to come and use it. I think the volunteers are all Springwater people, and it's nice when Springwater people are using it, not just people from our neighborhoods, right? It's there for everyone. So as a matter of fact, we commented to each other that they were such nice people there that we kept telling them, come back, use it anytime, right? So if they're using it, it's frankly, it's usually kept in better condition, and we like it. So anyway, so I encourage everyone to come out, hopefully around the Christmas holidays, and make use of the ice.
Not seeing any further updates. Do we have any notices of motion this evening? Or items for future consideration? Move on then to our bylaws. Mover and seconder for the bylaws, please. Councillors Garwood and Alexander, that the bylaws listed herein be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. The 2024-110 Snowmobile Trail Use Land Permission Agreement. All those in favor? That has carried. And a mover and seconder for the confirmation bylaw, please. Deputy Cabral, Councillor Alexander, that bylaw 2024-111 to confirm and adopt the proceedings of council of the regular meeting held on December 18th, 2024, listed here and be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. All those in favor? That is carried. I will now call upon Jack Amendolia from Watson and Associates for our presentation, please.
Just to start out, if we go to the first slide, just a little bit of a reminder and some context to how the process started. So back in 1990, not the whole process, but a little bit of context of the history of the municipality too. So back in 1994 was when Springwater was incorporated. Wards were formed in 2013-14. The municipality did a ward boundary review, made some changes to the wards, resulted in adjustments to wards 1, 2, 3, and 5. No changes since then. In 2019 and again in 2022, the county did a council composition review of the county. Council. No changes were made in either of those, so no impacts to anything that we're looking at here. And now fast forward to today, 2024, a lot of population growth has occurred in Springwater, lots more to come as we're all aware. And now the municipality is looking at whether those ward boundaries from 1314 still make sense in 2024. And maybe just a quick refresher, nothing that this council doesn't know, but right now a 7-member council, mayor, deputy mayor elected at large, 5 local councillors, 1 elected per ward. So if we go to the next slide, just some, again, a little bit of a refresher. So we talked at length throughout this process that there's no real, stipulated schedule, or the Municipal Act doesn't really get into how and when municipalities have to do these ward boundary reviews. So a lot of times we get asked, so how do you do them? A lot of it is based on, experiences, research that we gather, things that we've done in the past as a consultant team and other ward boundary reviews. But really, it's the guiding principles that are the sort of that consistent criteria that we use to evaluate not only any proposals that we come to you with, but also the existing system to really determine whether or not we need to do a review and need to make any changes. So just as a reminder, the guiding principles, representation by population, probably one of the most important ones, and really any democratic system globally, worldwide, that basic tenet of representation by population, that everyone gets roughly an equitable vote to everybody else, is really a basic tenet of democracy. Electoral trends and population trends. So again, I talked about Springwater, a lot of future growth planned in this municipality. So the guiding principles don't just want us to account for what the population is today, but they want us to try as much as we can to take into consideration what the wards are going to look like as this population growth occurs. Means of communication and accessibility in communities of interest, somewhat similar, but not basically recognizing that it's not just a population exercise. It's very important that we try to get as equitable as possible from a population perspective, but how wards are formed in relation to historical villages, existing neighborhoods, how those transportation patterns work within those wards is something also to consider. And then one of the last ones, geographical and topographical features as boundaries. We want to make these wards as recognizable as we can. We want to know where one begins and one ends, both from a council perspective and a resident perspective. We want to know what ward we're in. And when we ask that of residents, surprisingly sometimes, 10, 15, 20% of the survey respondents which ward they're in. The more we can use geography, man-made features, natural features, the easier it's going to be to identify those wards. So that's really the main things that we're trying to look at when we're evaluating your system or any system. So if we go to the next slide, a little bit again of a refresh on what we discovered with your system. So there was some good and there was some bad. And that's not unique. That's pretty much every system that when we're doing a ward boundary review, we look at. So some of the good stuff, when we just talked about communities of interest, when we look at the way the wards are created, they do largely reflect at least some of the historical communities of interest. Most of the wards, and again, not perfect, but most of the wards have some connectiveness. They make sense. Communities within the ward seem to associate and identify with other villages and communities within the ward. So pretty good with regard to that guiding principle, and also means of communication and accessibility. Where we start to get into some issues, the major one is population. And I want to be clear about population too. When we look at it, it's not bad, right? When I look at most of the wards, it's not bad, right? And we struggled with this a little bit in terms of how we wanted to evaluate it, because we thought it's partially successful, isn't it, if most of the wards are pretty close? The reason we gave it a no is because the disparity between the largest and the smallest was so great that we didn't think we could say that it is meeting the guiding principle of representation by population. If one of those wards was just slightly out and the other ones were pretty good, we would have probably given it a partially or even largely successful. But because of that disparity, we gave it a no. We thought it was a weakness to the system. And when we look at population trends and start to consider, and trust me, this is a little bit of crystal ball going on here with every population forecast right now. But when we look at how the municipality is expected to grow, that parity didn't get better, it got worse. And where we have some wards that are pretty good right now, when we look out 10 years, kind of the population parity starts to fall apart a little bit. So for that reason, we didn't think the existing system provided effective representation, and we thought that it was worthwhile to try and see if we can come up with some alternative configurations, and that's what we did. So we'll get into the preliminary options quickly and then the final options. But if we go to the next slide, just a little bit for council's perspective about some of the things that we heard. So as you know, there was a pretty robust public engagement as part of this. And when I say robust, the effort was robust. We can't always guarantee how many people participate, but we had decent participation as ward boundary reviews go. One way that we measured that participation, so we had virtual, we had web page engagement, we had in-person sessions, and then we also had a survey. And for us, the survey is sort of the most quantitative way to measure what we heard. So in terms of the surveys, we had 2 surveys, one in the first round. If you recall, it's a bit more free form and we're more or less asking, what do you feel? Only 17 respondents in the first round, so not great, but not atypical either. And then in the second round, a lot better, almost 100 respondents to the survey, which is, again, from a ward boundary perspective across the province, very, very decent. And when we look at the preferred preliminary options that we asked about, and this will make more sense in a second, we had the majority respond with option 1. The second highest was no preference of any, so it might mean that they didn't like any or just didn't have a preference of any. And the third highest was preliminary option 3, and then rounded out with preliminary option 2. When we asked about the guiding principles that we just talked about, probably not a surprise considering some of the things we discussed. Representation by population, almost 50% of the survey respondents thought that that should be the priority. And when we asked what ward you live in, Ward 3 had the highest percentage of survey respondents, but all the wards had some participation, and wards 5 and 4 were, not bad. Ward 5 at almost 30%, Ward 4 at over 16%, I think. I can barely see, sorry. 16%, Ward 3 at 42%. So again, good sort of spread, definitely a few wards that had the majority of respondents, but good spread throughout. Okay, so getting into the final options. So if we go to the next slide. So we had preliminary options that we went out to the public with in the second round. We had a total of 3 preliminary options that we looked at for feedback. And again, just as a reminder, I already got into this, but different factors that we used to evaluate those options. And like I just said, option 1 was the favored option from the public. Maybe just a quick second to talk about that. Public participation, public engagement component is important, but I got asked this the other night presenting to a council. What percentage do you put on the public? There is no percentage. We don't weight it like that. We use all of it to help inform our final options, but it's not that we say, okay, public option favored was this one, that accounts for 50% of it doesn't work that way at all. It really just helps to inform us, because the other day we made a recommendation and it was last in terms of the survey. But as your consultants or this particular client, we felt that, again, going back to the guiding principles and other things we heard, that the other options were better for that municipality and for that council. So I just wanted to put that out there, because sometimes we'll hear, but you didn't pick the one that the public picked. And again, the public component's really, really important to us. It ground truths a lot for us, but it's not just a vote. It's not just a popularity contest. The vote is up to you guys. Okay, so in terms of the final options, if we go to the next slide. So the first final option was preliminary option 3. We'll revert back to the preliminary option. So we just have that in brackets so that you can refer back to the other report and the preliminary options. So this final option we thought was the most balanced of all the options. By no means was it perfect in any single thing, but we thought when we evaluated it against the guiding principles, when we considered Springwater as a whole, and I think that's an important consideration as well, that this was one that worked the best considering all the guiding principles and the entirety of the municipality. So when we look at population parity, pretty decent. The one thing that I would point out is Ward 3 in the short term is underneath our acceptable range. But as growth starts to occur, it comes into parity. And really outside of Ward 5, when we look at the growth that's expected to occur, growth starts to spread out quite nicely in this example. Ward 5 might be some issues, but when we look at it, it might be something that we can fix with a line or two rather than doing a whole other ward boundary review at that time. Does it come with some risk? Of course. As I talked about, population forecasting right now, as an economist and a demographer, is a bit tough. There are almost no, really good historical trends to base our numbers on, and there's a lot of economic uncertainty, right? The one thing in Springwater with the Midhurst plan, we know with a high degree of certainty, I think, I'm even careful when I say that, but with a pretty good degree of certainty where some growth is going to get concentrated in this municipality because of the size of that plan. But the risk with this is, what if growth doesn't shake out as projected? What happens to some of this population parity? But then I would say to that, even in the short term, it's pretty good outside of that one ward. So it seems to work short term, long term, communities of interest, like I said, well balanced. If we go to the next option, this is our other final recommended option. This is based on preliminary option 1. And this one we call a bit of a tweak to the system, right? If you look at the way that the wards are designed, you'll see a lot of similarities to the way the wards look now. We've tried to address here, and going back to the evaluation, we thought communities of interest and communication accessibility worked pretty good with the existing system. So we tried to maintain that as much as possible, but at the same time fixing the most what we thought were the egregious issues. One ward, like I said, with 50% outside the sort of parity range, and quite a big range between the smallest and biggest ward. And really those lines that we talked about, where if you look at the existing map, and I think it's because some of the existing boundaries follow parcel fabrics, it's very hard to, it's just kind of this zigzag in places of line that's hard to make sense of. So we tried to address that and fix that. So again, it looks a lot like the existing system. It tries to address the most glaring parity issues. But if you look at the 2034 population, it's not able to address that, right? By keeping things relatively the same and all the good things I talked about, once that growth starts to shake out. So in this option, I think it's a really good, viable option, although it's very clear, and I will say this out loud, that it's likely that you're going to have to do this again in a couple of elections, but that may be the case anyways, right? With again, the uncertainty in the environment that we know, it may be and honestly, it's a good, and I don't want it to sound self-serving because I'm a consultant who does these things, but it's good practice for a lot of municipalities to look at this every 2 or 3 elections anyways. So that those are really the differences, right? The first option we're giving you, a little bit more balanced, more change, right? More difference than what we know today. A couple of wards in that first option, like that are quite large, that stretch down, and we've heard that don't really have the connectiveness that we want to, but it gives us the parity, the population we want. In the second one, a little bit more familiar with what you have today, fixes some of the most major issues, probably tells you that in a couple of elections, we're going to have to do this again. So we go to the next slide. I'll actually be really quick because I think I just summarized exactly this just shows you the 2 options. So you can see really what I was talking about with that large ward that comes all the way down from Hillsdale, all the way down to basically the southern portion of the municipality. We heard that loud and clear, that that's a really big ward. And we heard it from councillors that came to the session. We heard it from some people in the public. But again, we explained the rationale and what we're trying to do. And then the final option, like I just said. So we'll leave it at that. The next slide is just a summary of what I talked about, so I won't get back into it. Maybe just one point on there. So why not, we had 3 preliminary options. Why as consultants are we recommending the 2? I think we went into why, but why not option 2? It's also a very viable option. And in terms of what we thought, it could have gone almost either way. Option 2 is really very similar to preliminary option 1 or final option 2, but preliminary option 2, sorry, a little confusing, but it's just as viable. It's just that when we looked at the other one, a couple of things. Parity was a little bit better. We thought some of the lines were a little bit better in that one, and it was more favored from the public. So when we talk about how does the public help us, We had two that we thought were pretty close, and we looked at a couple of things, and the public sort of opinion there helped us give you a recommendation out of those two. So that's really why not option two. But if council, in their wisdom, thought that that's something they wanted to see from a consultant perspective, we think viable and defensible. Okay, so to finish off, what can council do with this information? So a couple of things. So the Municipal Act, as we have talked about in the past, and I reiterated today, doesn't give council a ton of guidance in terms of how to conduct a ward boundary review and what you should do, but it does tell you what you can do if you want to make a change. So council can do a few things. You can determine the size and composition of council. Again, that's not part of this review or part of this scope. It's been, what we've heard is that council size is adequate at this point. So not something we've looked at, but again, that's your prerogative to do that. And important to note that that's not appealable. Any decision council makes on size and composition, it's final. Council can also determine how council will be elected, and that's kind of what we're talking about tonight. So council can be elected by general vote, so an at-large system, can be elected by wards, so the system that you have right now, or it can be elected by a hybrid system if council so chose to do so, at large and combination of wards. And then the final part is council can then, if you're in a ward system and you elect to stay in a ward system, council can decide to divide or redivide the municipality into those wards or dissolve the existing wards. So if you decide to make a change to your existing ward boundary system, you would have to pass a bylaw to do so. You would have to provide notice of that bylaw. And that bylaw can be appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal by anybody. I think it's a few $100s to file that appeal. And they have, I believe it's probably on there somewhere, 45 days after the date of bylaw passage to file that appeal. With the options presented to you tonight, council can pick one of the consultant final options that we recommended. As I said before, council can pick one of the other preliminary options. Council can ask the consultant team or through staff to make some changes, amendments, or tweaks to one of the final options or one of the preliminary option, or status quo. Council can decide to make no change. So I will stop there. I knew I threw a lot of information at you. Let you digest that for a second, and then if there's any comments or questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And at this time, council, I'm just going to have a mover and second out on the floor. Councillors Garwood and Alexander, that the presentation from Watson Associates regarding the 2024 ward boundary review final options be received. And at this time, we can have any comments or questions. At this, I'll ask Clerk Marshall if she can describe the process to us, please.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. So by council receiving Watson's final options report this evening, the plan would be for to give council a bit of time to digest what you've just heard, maybe go back and speak with some of your residents about the options, and then the plan would be that the clerk's department would bring forward a report in February to allow council to make a decision at that time.
Thank you, Clerk Marshall. If you can pull back up the side-by-side wards 1 and 2. And the reason for it is I haven't had a lot of communication from residents pertaining to this, but what I have heard is I'm going to call it Ward 2. And if you scroll to where just below Menacing is the Menacing wetlands, and no one lives in those wetlands. And I'm just curious if possible, when we're providing mapping for the residents, much like Orr Lake is taken out, if we could have that highlighted so that when residents see it, because pictures paint 1,000 words, and I think that might be more accurate. And I think the only other concern off the top of my head is this was triggered for our council because of a 25% variance. And I do have concern with moving forward with an option that still has that 25% variance in it. It seems to me that we're not really solving a problem if this same problem still exists. So those would be my comments. Councillor Garwood.
In
Use your microphone, please, Councillor Garwood.
Apologies, I didn't have that on. What I was saying, and I will repeat it again for the recording, that I haven't had a ton of communication from the community on the matter, understanding Ward 1 doesn't have any options based upon the final recommendation 1 and 2. The batteries stay the same with incorporating Ore Lake, of course. What my concern is just geographically looking at the final recommendation number 1 and the mass and the size of Ward 2 specifically, understanding, we've gone through an election, we've knocked on doors, we've driven concession roads, regardless if the population falls within that range that we're looking at, that's still a significant undertaking. You're almost covering, or you probably are covering, half the municipality with that. Now, I say that, understanding that it is the recommendation number 1, and there are pieces to it that I see beneficial. That is my main concerns at this time. I also agree. I believe it's important that we are keeping communities together. So Hillsdale, Phelpston, Minising, etc., keeping Enton Mills in Ward 3. So I understand the challenges that the consultants faced when reviewing this, and it's not going to be perfect. But I do echo the mayor's comments in regards to concern with potentially just shifting the parity from wards 1 and 4 to other wards. Thank you.
Deputy Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I just looking at it here, and I do say there was some minor adjustments to some of the wards, simply, making them on one side of the road versus the other side of the road. But when we're talking about the 25% parity, on the one option where it still remains, is that because we're looking down the road at it becoming more balanced as we move forward? So reality is we'd still have it today, but the expectation is that over the course of the next few years, it would start to diminish. Okay, that was my question.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and through the mayor, exactly that. Like that one ward, like it's below, but it should. And again, I mean, I say should because of the environment of population forecasting, but that's exactly right. It should grow into parity as population grows and fills in that ward.
Yeah, and if we could just move forward to the slide with the definition for option 2. And the clarification I had there was on the percentage option 2, there it is. So this is suggesting that while other wards are growing, the population for 2034 in Ward 5 would be approximately 17.
Yeah, would be off the charts.
Right. So
yeah.
I felt what Deputy Cabral was asking was actually opposite of what I was to understand. So this is suggesting that in 2034, we would have one member of council with 4,000 and another with 17,000.
Yeah, to be clear, like I hope I translated in the presentation, not viable. Like that 2034, like and I think we've reiterated this in the report, like if growth shakes out like that, like council would have to, well, not have to, you do whatever you want, but the recommendation from your clerk would probably be like, you need to fix this. And quite frankly, like when we start to think about 2034 and the sort of population change that we're talking about, it's probably going to be, and I'm not talking, I'm not trying to recommend anything at this point, but at that point, like it's probably going to be a worthwhile review. Do we have enough? This size still makes sense when we're adding that much population. So yeah, very clearly, like that is not a viable system past 2 elections.
Thank you for that. Anything further, council? Not seeing anything. So our motion here this evening is that the presentation from Watson and Associates regarding the 2024 ward boundary review final options be received. All those in favor? And that is carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. See you in a few months.
And at this time, council will be moving on to item 3.2, our City of Barrie proposed boundary expansion update. And I will now call upon Stefan from Hampson Consulting.
It's partner in Hampson Consulting, and we've been retained to look at the long-term land requirements for the township of Springwater, as well as your neighboring municipalities of the township of Warramedonte and the city of Barrie. It's part of a process involving 4 municipalities, the city, the two townships, and the county of Simcoe, and a process that is also being supported by the Office of the Provincial Land and Development Facilitator. And the purpose of today's presentation really is to summarize the findings of our stage 2 work, which addresses 2 questions. The first is whether Barrie or...
My apologies for interrupting, Stefan. When you turn to your right, we seem to lose you. So I don't know. I do apologize. I just would like to make sure that council is able to hear the entire presentation.
That's okay. Madam Mayor, I'm going to... All right. Well, so the presentation then that I wanted to start with you is to deal with these 2 questions. And the first is whether Barrie, Oro-Medonte, and Springwater have enough land to accommodate their projected population and employment growth over the long term, specifically to 2051. And if they do, then, this analysis sort of reaches its conclusion, and we can sort of close it up and pick it up again in 10 years or whenever the city and the county of Simcoe next do their official plan updates. But if any or all of the municipalities don't have enough, then we've been asked to describe sort of what options are available in a defined study area to accommodate that growth. And the area in question is shown in the map here, and it's covered by the orange boundary there, which is, I'm sure, very familiar to you. So that's the boundary covering the townships and the northern part of the city of Barrie. I did want to just quickly acknowledge from the get-go that Barrie plays a somewhat unique role in this study area from the perspective of growth management, simply because of its size, its central location in the county, and the scale of growth that is occurring there. And obviously it serves as a regional service center, and is also the prime mover in this process. In other words, this study and the process more broadly is responding to claims and proposals made by the city. So much of what you're going to see in this presentation responds to these proposals. I don't want to minimize the fact that Springwater and Dante and the county also have their own land needs and certainly be looking.
Stefan, we're just going to take a quick recess and see if there's an opportunity for you to maybe reconfigure the audio. You're continuing to cut in and out volume wise for us.
I apologize, Madam Mayor. So I'll try and work my end, and if you can do the same, perhaps.
You seem to be quite fine at some moments, and then it just trickles right out. Is there anything on that? Is there an opportunity to attempt it without the headphones?
How is that?
Much better.
Okay. There we go. Okay, I'm going to just back up by 1 minute. And again, my apologies. I was just sort of speaking a little bit about the role of Barrie in this process, because I think we need to acknowledge up front that it does play an outsized role in growth management by virtue of its size, its location, and its important role as a regional service center, not just within the study area, but also for the county as a whole. And it's also, Barrie that has sort of been the prime mover in the process. It is the one that has made claims and put forward proposals. So a lot of what I'm going to be speaking to in this presentation is responding to those claims. But I certainly don't want to marginalize the fact that the township of Springwater and Oro-Medonte and the county broadly also have land needs, and I will be addressing those directly. But I did want to start with talking a little bit about employment areas, because really it's the city's claims about a lack of employment lands that first started this process. You will know that we've issued a report last week summarizing our conclusions about some of these matters. And when it comes to Barrie's employment area land needs, our view is that, when we look at the long-term supply of land in the city, it appears to be sufficient to accommodate its forecast need to 2051. We have sort of looked at the lands very closely. We visited the lands, and we have also, done a lot of sort of desktop analysis of the lands. We've also looked at the analysis that the city undertook to establish what lands it needs through its municipal comprehensive review, which it did between 2019 and 2022. We feel that there are some fairly ambitious assumptions about the density of employment on these lands, and the city is also planning to build out pretty much every parcel of land in its supply, and that's not particularly great from a market choice perspective. You always want, some vacant land available, and so, taken together, while we think the city in theory has enough long-term land supply, it probably is going to need more sometime in the mid-2040s. And that will warrant a review during the next time it does an official plan update. But it certainly doesn't mean that it needs to add lands right now to deal with that particular problem. However, it does have a short supply of, ready for market lands, shovel-ready lands, partly because of a municipal service delivery issue. It needs to get pipes quickly to a lot of the land supply that you see in blue there on the map. Part of it is a provincial investment issue, where interchanges need to be built along Highway 400 to sort of open those lands up to the kind of truck traffic that's going to be coming in and out of those areas. And part of it is because the land fabric itself doesn't lend itself particularly well in some areas to, the accumulation of large land parcels and the opportunity for clustering of employment areas. Very important. So these are, of course, important concerns, but the shovel readiness, shortage of shovel readiness is not really something that can be solved by Barrie annex land city, because it does take time to plan and develop annexed lands, and we're talking about a time frame that needs to switch on lands very, very quickly. And you can see the proposed land shown in orange there, and so that sort of rectangular piece to the northeast of the city, that's in Ora-Medonte, and you can see the lands that have been proposed in Springwater by Barrie in orange there at the boundary of the township and the city. I should just mention that this map showing the land of Springwater has gone through various iterations. And so the one that you see here and the one that you see in our report is the same map that was proposed to Springwater Council.
Stefan, I'm just going to ask you if you could just repeat that. And it does seem that as you turn your head to the right, we lose you. I don't know if maybe we could shuffle over a little bit and that might help, but we'll try. If you could just repeat the variations of the mapping, please.
Yes. So this particular map showing the Springwater lands has gone through a couple of iterations over the last year to 18 months. And so the one that's being shown here is the same map that was proposed to Springwater Council in its council meeting of November 2023. And that's the same map that appears in our report. So I just wanted to put that on the record. So the situation in Oro-Medonte is somewhat different. Oro-Medonte has some very well located employment area lands right along Highway 11 there, and including a very strategically located employment area around the Lake Simcoe Regional Airport. And the county official plan is premised on all of these employment lands being built out over the course of the next 25 years to 2051 at rural densities. So there's no assumption that any of these lands would be serviced. If servicing did come to the airport or any of these other lands, then obviously the employment potential of the township would be greater than what's set out in the county official plan. But right now, there's no shift to a sort of more urban employment land structure anticipated. And that's in line with the Oro-Medonte employment land strategy. So we do not see a need for additional employment area lands for Oro-Medonte. When we look more closely at the lands that Barrie is proposing for annexation within Oro-Medonte, we generally conclude that these lands are not particularly well suited for employment uses. If you look at the map there, you can see that a good chunk of those areas are covered in green, and they are undevelopable because they are sort of environmentally constrained. The areas in yellow are agricultural uses, and some of them are in active agricultural use, including a winery in the middle there. And the areas in orange is a rural use. So they are constrained in some respects. They don't really allow for they constrain users who want to configure large parcels in many areas. From the township's perspective, they would represent a major new urban center. So there may be all sorts of financial consequences associated with that if it became sort of part of Oro-Medonte. But from the perspective of Barrie's employment land needs, they don't really address the lack of shovel-ready employment areas that I mentioned earlier. There are also interchange issues, we think, up by Highway 11 there. Lots of different turning circles and cemeteries and churches and T-junctions and bridges that get in the way, perhaps, of the large amount of truck traffic that might be required to access the highway, notwithstanding the fact that there are water and sewer services along Penetanguishing Road. So the bottom line is these lands would take some time to develop, even though the services are there along Penetanguishing Road, but compatibility issues with the residential areas, constraints within the area that's been identified, and some infrastructure issues as well. When we look at Springwater's employment area land needs, unlike Oro-Medonte, Springwater has relatively few employment areas, and none are adjacent to the Highway 400 corridor or the Highway 26 corridor that sort of links up with Wasaga Beach Collingwood area. The employment areas in Springwater really serve local rather than regional needs. And so for us, what warrants particular attention here is whether the township has sufficient land to provide the broad range of employment opportunities to the significant population that is being planned for in the township, especially in the Midhurst secondary plan. The county official plan is premised on the ratio of jobs to population actually declining in Springwater, and that's without build out of the Midhurst secondary plan area. So if Midhurst proceeds far quicker than anticipated under the county official plan, then we would expect perhaps the ratio of jobs to people to come down perhaps even more, given the supply of employment area. So that is something to note. When we look at the proposal that Barrie has made to Springwater for potential annexation areas, we see some similar problems that we saw with the Oro-Medonte areas. So I'm going to move from, right to left here, and if we look at the lands sort of east of the 400, those are fairly well located, certainly from an accessibility to the highway perspective. There's some topography issues. They're not particularly flat in many areas, which is not great for large-scale employment uses. And there are certainly questions about how and whether you can bring services across the highway corridor for the area in brown there at the top. As we move to the west, you can see that the areas around Little Lake are significantly constrained by environmental protection lands. About 40% of all the lands in that piece are sort of undevelopable. And then if we move further west, we can see the lands sort of due north of the city. Those are flat, and the terrain's pretty good for large-scale employment uses. But when Midhurst is fully built out, those lands are going to be squished between a large residential area to the north and a large residential area to the south. So not the greatest location for industrial uses, and connectivity issues to the highway also comes into play here. And then if we move to the lands to the west of the city, perhaps more possibilities here, but in that these are fairly adjacent to existing employment areas, and you could get to the highway a little bit more simply. But there are certainly environmental constraints there, and there's an aggregate area there to the north. So there are problems with that as well. So just to summarize the employment area situation, our conclusion is that that Highway 400 corridor extending north of Barrie along 11 and 400 is an extremely important employment area for employment uses, and it meets it's going to meet a strong demand, both local and regional, and in fact, even national and international, for the movement of goods from Northern Ontario to Southern Ontario, and so on and so forth. And local municipalities and indeed the county are planning for and putting in infrastructure in place all the way along that corridor to support that demand. We can see in Bradford, West Gwillimbury, where services are available on those employment lands, construction is proceeding very quickly. Innisfil, the strategic employment areas in the northern part of Innisfil, they're unserviced, but we already see construction of activity going on there. So there's no reason why Barrie's employment areas in the south, once serviced, wouldn't proceed and meet the demand that's clearly underway. And in fact, some of the areas in southern Barrie have advantages that the other areas don't have, particularly proximity to labor supply and some rail and transit links that the other areas don't have. So the bottom line is that Barrie's employment area supply is sufficient to meet long-term demand. They certainly have short-term shovel-ready supply problems, particularly for larger parcels. But those problems, we think, cannot really be addressed through annexing land in Oro-Medonte or Springwater. The case for doing that is relatively weak. I wanted to speak a little bit more about community area lands. And these are lands that are really centered around housing and the supporting infrastructure and services and local retail and institutional employment to sustain residential communities. Madam Mayor, you still hearing me okay?
We are now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to take a minute and speak a little bit about the housing market and housing market dynamics, because each municipality is not its own sort of universe here. There's no Springwater housing market and then a separate Barrie housing market. They kind of work together, and you can see that if you look at the graph that's on screen right now. What this does is it shows you population growth across the Simcoe Census Division, which encapsulates the cities of Barrie and Orillia, which are shown in green and gold respectively, and then in the county as a whole, which is shown in red. And if you look sort of in the early part of this century, Barrie accommodated most of the population growth in the area. Before 2006, it was one of the fastest growing places in the country. And then around 2006, 2007, it ran out of greenfield land for housing. And growth really slowed during that period. Of course, the 2008, 2009 recession didn't help at all, and that slowed growth, across the whole region. But then coming out of the recession, you can see that Barrie's greenfield supply stayed low, and population growth was accordingly low, but growth picked up in the county, accelerated rapidly and peaked in around 2017. And then in recent years, we've seen Barrie's greenfield supply return. And the point I want to make here is that the demand for housing, there's a clear relationship between the demand for housing in the city and the surrounding municipalities. It is a regional demand. It is relatively finite. Barrie has some advantages in that market that make it very attractive to people looking for apartments, for example, especially retirees who want to be near the hospital. But county municipalities are making great changes in offering more housing options for older adults to remain in their communities over the long term. So Barrie's competitive advantage might decrease as time moves on. The other point I just want to highlight here, when it comes to Barrie itself, this is the number of housing starts that we've seen in the city annually going back to the early 90s. And in that sort of wave of growth that Barrie experienced in the late 90s, early part of 2000s, most of the housing was single detached, meeting the demand at the time for family kind of homes, family style homes. But more recently, the growth that's taken off in Barrie is much more diverse, with a housing mix that includes a number of medium density and higher density forms. And so that's an important feature of what's going on in Barrie. The other point I want to make about Barrie's growth is that it is not fast enough right now to achieve its 2051 population objectives. The white line on the screen there shows you its current growth trajectory, housing trajectory. The dotted green line shows you the trajectory it needs to be on in order to meet its housing pledge target. And the gold line is the trajectory it needs to be on from now all the way to 2051 in order to meet its population target in its official plan. That's an extremely important element of the analysis you'll see at the end of this presentation. So when we look at how Barrie is going to accommodate the growth that it's planning for, its official plan commits the city to building 50% of all new homes within the built-up area of the city. That is the already developed area. And 50%, the remaining 50% of the homes are to be accommodated in the greenfield lands. Just a few numbers so that the numbers at the end of the presentation make sense to you. When Barrie did its official plan, it was premised on accommodating about 56,000 housing units to 2051. Growth was slower than it thought. So when 2021 rolled around and the census results came out, it was actually 55,000 homes, and they were planning for 62,000 homes. So now they have to build 62,000 homes to 2051 rather than 56,000. 50% of those need to be in the built-up area. That's 31,000. And then the other 31,000 will be in the greenfield areas. So it's about 1,000 units per year in the built-up area and another 1,000 units per year in the greenfield. And what we want to do is test how realistic the prospects for accommodating that level of growth are. In the built-up area, it's 1,000 units per year at 50% intensification rate. Since Barrie did its comprehensive review up to sort of mid-year this year, it's been intensifying at around 35%. So 35% is very high, certainly relative to the historic intensification rate, but it's much lower than what it needs to achieve that growth target. It's going to need many, many more cranes in the sky in order to get to 50%. And remember, it needs to grow a lot faster than it is right now. So it's not just the percentage that needs to increase, it's the actual amount of units that are being built. And most of these units in the intensification area are being built as apartments, specifically high-rise apartments. Barrie has a very progressive official plan. There are no issues with the supply of land in its intensification areas. And it has put into place a lot of very ambitious infrastructure plans to make sure that, all the key elements are there to make sure that the 50% can be achieved. It has a development charge bylaw in place to ensure that that infrastructure is paid for. And you can see the various strategic growth areas set out in the map here. But I do want to emphasize that this is an ambitious goal that the city has set for itself, and it represents a truly transformational pattern of growth moving forward. Turning now to the other 50%, the 50% of units that need to be accommodated in the greenfield areas. So most of the greenfield areas in Barrie are in the southern part of the city, and they are located within the red lines that are shown on this map. And when you look within the red lines, you'll see a lot of light green. Those are non-developable lands, environmentally protected lands. And then you'll see that there's green hatching in many areas as well. Those are lands on which there are active applications. So, most of the greenfield areas have active applications on or near them. So we have a pretty good idea of how this greenfield land might develop, both in its form and its density. So remember, we're trying to get 31,000 units in these greenfield areas. In the lands that are covered by applications, we know that there's been about 4,000 units that have been built already, of which 11% are apartments. And we have another 13,000 that are in the application process, of which 45% are apartments. And we think it's a legitimate question as to whether all those apartments are going to be built. So, what's actually being built is 11% apartments. What's in some of the plans is 45%. But the really important question is the remaining lands, the vacant lands where there's no applications yet. There's about 350 hectares of land available in those vacant lands, and we need to squeeze 14,000 units on those lands. And the question is, can you do it? And our conclusion in our report is that you probably can't. But how much land you're short depends a little bit about, the assumptions you make about the density of those greenfield areas. And so we've created two scenarios here. One scenario is based on the planned density of Barrie. So that assumes the 50% intensification rate. It assumes 45% of those apartments in the current applications get built. And it also assumes the same high density for the remaining 351 hectares. And if the city does that, it's still short 265 hectares. Scenario 2 is what we think would be a more realistic view of how things might play out in Barrie's greenfield area. Here, we're still assuming the 50% intensification, but we're going to assume that the densities that take place in the greenfield areas are more similar to what we're seeing being built in the higher density suburban areas of the GTA. And in this particular scenario, Barrie is short 630 hectares. So just to summarize, Barrie has a very progressive official plan. It's planning for much more compact development, much more intensification than it has in the past, and we've seen evidence that that is taking place. The current rate of intensification is not high enough to hit that target, and in fact, the volume of units needs to increase in order for it to happen. But of more concern is in the greenfield areas, the density of housing needs to be much higher, order of magnitude higher than anywhere else in the Greater Golden Ocean, and very different from what's being constructed or planned right now. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, the greenfield, those vacant lands in Barrie would need to be built at around 100 persons and jobs per hectare in order to squeeze those units into the remaining lands. So, look at the kind of targets that are in place elsewhere in the GTA. In York Region, that's anywhere from 55 to 70. Peel Region's a bit higher, 70. Durham Region, lower, 53. But in Simcoe County, it's anywhere from 45 to 55, including 45 in Springwater. So less than half the densities that would be required in Barrie. And what that means is that if Barrie's greenfield lands cannot meet the housing demand in the city, then that demand will go somewhere else. It won't transform itself. If there's a demand for row houses or single or semi-detached units, the people who are looking for those homes won't choose to live in apartments in Barrie. They'll go find a single detached unit or a semi-detached unit somewhere else. It could well be in Midhurst or Essa or Innisfil. So just want to touch on Ora-Medante's community area lands. So the majority of growth forecast for the township is going to be focused in the service settlement areas of Craighurst and Horseshoe Valley, with some limited growth in the rural areas. But the county official plan is really premised on Ora-Medante, maintaining its existing rural character and then not really shifting to a more urban settlement area structure. Springwater is quite different, of course. Right now, Elmvale is the only serviced settlement area, but the Midhurst secondary plan is quite a different sort of beast, if you like, and represents a very different kind of pattern of settlement for the township. There's certainly enough land in that secondary plan area, we think, to accommodate the growth that might occur to 2051, however fast Midhurst actually ends up growing. And we can see here that, there's lots of development in the pipeline in Springwater. How quickly it proceeds is a fairly open question. But certainly the township has and is putting into place all of the pieces that are necessary to allow development to occur swiftly, and even more swiftly, perhaps, than the county official plan anticipates. And that includes water and wastewater treatment facilities and the full range of communities. So just to summarize, the case for annexing additional lands for Barrie, we think is relatively weak if we're only talking about employment areas. But there's a relatively strong case for Barrie needing more land for housing in order to meet its population growth targets. And if you're going to do an annexation exercise, you should probably think about a comprehensive process that looks at both community and employment areas, that look perhaps at employment area needs beyond. So we've created two scenarios for this, one based on that sort of planned density in Barrie, which translates into about 390 hectares of land. And the scenario two, which we think is a more sort of typical suburban density scenario, which translates into 930 hectares of land. About 2/3 of that for community area and 1/3 for. And so, there are really, there's very many different options for addressing this, but very, very broadly, there are two pathways here. One is to keep the municipal boundaries of the various municipalities as they are in place. And what would happen if that was done is that as Barrie grew, it would slowly become more denser. We already see that happening, and that would continue in the short term. But probably by the mid-2030s, it would run out of greenfield supply for many segments of the housing market. Those segments of the housing market would probably be absorbed by the surrounding municipalities, including in Midhurst. And over time, some kind of servicing arrangements would probably need to be put in place.
Apologies, Stefan. If I can just ask that if you can continue to speak right into the microphone, I feel that the conclusion part is something that we all want to hear every word of.
And I just flipped my paper over the microphone, which is why I'm sorry. So, as time goes on, Barrie, in this kind of scenario, Barrie may well have excess capacity of its municipal systems and facilities. It would certainly continue to serve as a regional service center for major health and educational institutions. So, we might see situations where some kind of servicing agreements or cost sharing agreements would be likely between the city and its surrounding municipalities. And as those became more complex, that would evolve, we think, ultimately into some kind of regional governance model to deal with growth management and, the servicing issues. The second option then would be to adjust municipal boundaries to annex land to Barrie so that growth would continue to occur across the study area, but Barrie, a portion of the lands would allow Barrie to accommodate its housing needs and hit its 2051 population and employment targets. And of course, this would involve a more detailed analysis of potential annexation configurations, looking more closely at servicing costs and financial impacts on all the municipalities. And, right now we've been asked to sort of draw up a sort of possible stage 3 work plan on that basis, and that requires sort of expertise in various areas, including engineering and municipal finance and natural heritage, and we have the experts as part of our team to do that kind of work. So we will take direction from the participating municipalities on what to do, but rest assured that the expertise is there in hand. So thank you, Madam Mayor, and I'm sorry that I caused such trouble with audio. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Stefan. So Council, we do have 2 separate resolutions before us tonight. The first one that we have in front of us is the presentation from Hempson. So for questions on that, I would just need a mover and seconder to receive this, please. I have Councillors Fischer and Moore that the presentation from Hempson Consulting regarding the joint land needs analysis and study stage 2 summary be received. And then separately from that, we do have our CAO's report and resolution to be dealt with separately. So if there's any questions for Stefan on the presentation, any further detail. Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I just wanted to go back to the 100 people per hectare and the target that of 100 that Barrie has in their official plan. Is that a target that they have themselves, or is that provincially directed?
Stefan?
Yes, through you, Madam Mayor. So that's not a target in the Barrie official plan. That is our estimate of what they would need to, the density they would need to build at on those remaining vacant lands in order to hit their population target.
And if I could just ask, you did cut out there a bit. I think the clarification is there are cities and areas that have made housing pledges to the province. So is this the numbers that are being used? Is it a Barrie initiated target, or is this part of the official plan?
So there are 2 targets for the community area land needs assessment. One is the 2031 housing pledge target, which we think that the city has supply at any rate to meet, even though it's not growing fast enough to hit it. But the more important target for the land needs that we've laid out in the conclusion here is the 2051 population target. And that is a target that is in the Barrie official plan and comes ultimately from the previous provincial growth plan.
Follow on?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm not sure, Hanson Consulting, if we were to look at the natural heritage, do you look at the environmental factors yourself, or do you hire that out to other specialties? Particularly around water. Thank you.
Stefan?
So through you, Madam Mayor. So for this stage 2 work, we have excluded from any of the land needs calculations any lands that are identified in an official plan as natural heritage system or have some kind of environmental protection. So those are not included in any of the land needs. And the mapping that I showed with some green areas, in the proposed boundary lands, all the green there is taken from official plan designations. For the stage 3 work, if we're going to be looking more closely at annexation areas, we have a natural heritage specialist that would look more closely at the lands themselves and to see what kind of level of protection would be required if they were to be urbanized. And I think this comes into play most specifically in some of those areas around Little Lake.
Councillor Moore?
Thank you. And thank you for your indulgence. And does that include then watersheds, groundwater runoff, that sort of thing as well?
Yes, Madam Mayor, it certainly does. And certain watershed boundaries will certainly come into play when looking at servicing requirements for water and wastewater. So absolutely, the engineering analysis for stage 3 would certainly be looking at those issues.
Not seeing anything. Oh, Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. So just a question about terminology here. This started as a discussion about boundary adjustment, and you've used the word annexation in your report. Can you explain to us the difference, or is there any?
Stefan?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I don't believe that there's a difference between a boundary adjustment and an annexation for the work that we've been doing. Certainly, I think we've lumped it all in as the same kind of thing. But I recognize that there are lots of different kinds of models for planning for and governing and providing services to different lands. So there may be all sorts of different governance models that we're not properly picking up when we use the word annexation.
Follow on?
Thank you. And when you showed the map of the I think there was 3 different study areas in the township of Springwater, am I correct? You kind of alluded to that there was other maps, but this was the map just for demonstration purposes. Was there other study areas that weren't identified in that map, that this map here that we see that has 3 very distinct study areas?
Yes, through you, Madam Mayor. So I don't know how many iterations of this particular map there were, but I certainly saw one other that included proposed lands that were larger than what you're seeing on the screen here.
Councillor Garwood?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I'm not sure who to direct this to, but understanding that each municipality has a financial commitment to these discussions, will a future work plan include a costing analysis to outline each municipality's financial obligation through stage 3?
I'm going to turn to CEO Schmidt for that.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Garwood. Excuse me, sorry. On tonight's agenda, the action report that staff have brought forward, it does speak to developing a work plan amongst all parties, including Hempson, and reporting back in January with that work plan for council's consideration, which would also include potential costs for each party.
Not seeing anything further at this time. So council, we do have it moved in second that the presentation from Hempson Consulting regarding the joint land needs analysis and study stage 2 summary be received. Council, all those in favor? And that is carried. We will now move on to our action report, and may I have a mover and seconder for this, please? I have Deputy Cabral and Councillor Alexander. That the report from the Chief Administrative Officer, actually, I will just turn to CEO Schmidt, and then I'll read the whole thing after. CEO Schmidt.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. So the report that's in front of council this evening for your consideration is really meant to provide some background on how we got here. And so I won't go through all of those details, but essentially what's being asked tonight is that three key things, I guess, is really to, which you've somewhat done already, is receive the report for information from Hempson. So their final report that Stefan just spoke to is being asked to be received. The second thing is for council to consider to continue to engage in the discussions with the Office of the Provincial Facilitator, as well as Hempson and the other remaining parties, the City of Barrie, Oro-Medonte, and the County of Simcoe. And the idea, again, was to bring forward a work plan to discuss some of the options that have been identified in the reports thus far. And then finally, again, as I mentioned earlier, really bringing that work plan back to council in the new year by mid-January, hopefully, to present to council and to also provide you with what the costs would be to the township to undertake that work. And that's really what council is being asked to consider tonight. I know there has been some other discussions out there about, where do we go from here and have specific lands being identified. Through the discussion tonight, you see what City of Barrie did propose to Springwater back in September of last year. Those are the lands that were provided and presented to members of council. As for other mappings, yes, we're familiar with that. There are other reiterations of that map that were submitted by the City of Barrie to the Minister of Municipal Affairs back in December of last year as part of their official plan amendment. Those lands were not presented to Springwater Council, but staff are very familiar with those lands. And so they don't form part of tonight's presentation. That said, again, I think we need to make sure that everybody's aware and it's clarified that although those lands were lands that Barrie's identified, should council agree and all parties agree to move to the next stage, additional lands will likely be identified through that process and will be brought forward for council's consideration as to how you'd like to proceed. So again, I think we just need to clarify that the study area includes the borders between Barrie Springwater and Barrie Oro-Medonte. It's not just specific to what Barrie has presented or previously presented to council. It's the study area, like I said, includes the full boundary between Barrie Oro and Barrie Springwater.
Any questions or clarification? Not seeing any. I do have this moved and seconded. So the motion is that the report from the Chief Administrative Officer regarding the City of Barrie proposed boundary expansion update dated December 11th, 2024 be received, and that council receive the joint land needs study analysis from December 6th prepared by Hempson Consulting for information, and that the Township of Springwater continue to engage with the Office of the Provincial Land and Development Facilitator, Hempson Consulting, and the City of Barrie, Township of Oro-Medonte, and the County of Simcoe to develop a work plan for analysis and options identified by the Joint Lands Needs Analysis and Study, and that staff report back to council regarding the contents of the proposed work plan on or before January 15th, 2025. Anything further on this? All those in favor? And that has carried. And before we do adjourn, I would just like to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a happy holiday. And I hope that our staff have a little bit of disconnection and take some time and recharge and look forward to everything that we're going to accomplish in 2025 together. So Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Mover and seconder. Councillor Garwood, Councillor Moore, that the regular meeting of the Township of Springwater does adjourn at 7 o'clock to meet again at the regular meeting at January 15th, 2025, 6:30 p.m. All those in favor? And that has carried. Thank you.
That was the update from Springwater. Thank you for watching.